welcome to your deep dive. Today we're really diving deep into Batman and Superman and going way beyond that. You know, that age-old question, who would win in a fight, which, is always fun to think about. But we're really going deeper. We're going to dive into the philosophy behind these iconic heroes. And to help us with this, we have your stack of excerpts from Batman, Superman, and Philosophy. Badass or Boy Scout. Get ready to uncover what really makes these characters tick and maybe even question, is Superman really the hero we think he is? Or is Batman maybe the better example? Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. You've given us a really interesting mix of chapters here, each exploring these heroes from a different philosophical angle. We've got everything from like Nietzsche's Übermensch to the ethics of vigilantism. There's even a chapter that explores, and this is one of my favorites already, it's making me think if Superman might actually be, well, kind of a jerk. I don't know about you, but when I saw that title, I was like, what? How could Superman be a jerk?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because this idea of Superman as a jerk that the book is tackling, it isn't really about him like being mean or anything like that. It's exploring a really interesting ethical dilemma. Like, what if Superman being around, what if just him existing actually prevents us as people from becoming heroic ourselves? Because if he's always going to be there to swoop in and save the day, then why should any of us even bother?
That is a really thought-provoking point, because I've always seen Superman as that symbol of hope, right? He's the one who inspires us to be better. But this idea that he might actually be making us complacent is kind of mind-blowing.
Exactly. Yeah. It makes us question all of our assumptions about, what it even means to be a hero in the first place. The chapter argues that real heroism, true heroism, might actually be more about empowering others to act and to be heroic themselves, and not just swooping in and fixing everything ourselves all the time. It makes you wonder, if Batman, even though he's just a human, maybe he encourages more individual responsibility just because of how he operates, relying on strategy and ingenuity rather than superpowers.
Yeah, that's a great point. And speaking of strategy, there's a chapter in here that dives into Batman as a master of what it calls mimesis. I'll be honest, I had to look that one up.
Yeah.
But it basically means Batman's a brilliant actor. Like, he's using his whole persona to manipulate his enemies, to strike fear in their hearts.
Right. It's not just about, putting on a scary costume, right? This book argues that he understands the power of symbols and how to use them to his advantage. Like, everything from the bat symbol itself to his silence to the way he moves in the shadows, it's all carefully calculated to make criminals question everything. It makes them fear the unknown.
It's like he's putting on this huge theatrical performance, but his audience is made up of Gotham's entire underworld. But going back to that idea of Superman potentially holding us back as humans, there's another excerpt that tackles this whole problem of evil, as philosophers call it, and it uses that concept to examine if superheroes like Superman actually make the world worse in some ways.
And what I think is really interesting here is that this excerpt doesn't just talk about Superman. It directly compares him to Batman. It argues that Superman might, unintentionally discourage human action by always being the one to solve everything. But Batman's existence is itself a testament to human potential. I mean, think about it. He has no superpowers. He's just a man. But he stands toe-to-toe with these gods and monsters. And he does it all through his own intellect, through grit, willpower, and just by refusing to give up.
So what you're saying is that this excerpt suggests that maybe Batman's actually the more inspiring figure, because he's proof that we don't need superpowers, to be heroic ourselves, to overcome challenges, and to fight for what's right.
Precisely. It challenges us to rethink our definition of what a hero can be and what they can look like. And then this excerpt, it also gets into the whole concept of utilitarianism, which is the philosophical idea that the best action is always the one that creates the most good for the most people. And Superman obviously often embodies this philosophy, right? He's always making these really tough choices for what he believes is the greater good, even when they seem morally ambiguous to the rest of us.
And which brings us back to that whole Superman as a jerk thing again, right?
Oh.
I mean, the chapter uses this really interesting example where Superman has to make a choice. He has to choose between stopping for a snack because he's hungry or potentially saving a bunch of people's lives.
Wow.
And it really makes you think about the impossible weight of the responsibility that he carries on his shoulders every single day.
Oh, yeah.
And if even Superman can truly be everywhere at once.
Yeah, it really highlights the limitations of even, seemingly limitless power. And it contrasts Superman with Batman, who operates from a totally different moral code, which philosophers call deontology. Basically, it means that he follows this really strict personal code, almost like an unbreakable set of rules no matter what the consequences are.
So we got Superman. He's the alien who chooses to be this symbol of hope and makes these big decisions based on what he believes will save the most lives. And then we have Batman, who is just a human like the rest of us, but he's driven by this need for vengeance, and he's bound by this incredibly strict, unbreakable personal code. I mean, those are basically two completely opposite approaches to heroism. But what led them to these different paths? There's a really interesting chapter that basically says it all goes back to their origin stories.
And that's where things get really interesting, right? Because the book claims that Superman's origin story is, at its core, fundamentally about hope. It argues that his parents, sending him to Earth, this tiny baby in a rocket ship, that was an incredible act of faith. It was a belief in a brighter future that they may never even live to see. But then you have Batman. His entire origin is rooted in fear and tragedy, and that shapes his entire worldview.
Yeah. And, it's so true when you think about it. Superman, his upbringing, even though he was an alien on a strange planet, it was filled with so much love. And that really instilled in him, I think, this sense of optimism and hope for humanity. But then you have Bruce Wayne, who witnessed this horrific trauma as a child, seeing his parents murdered right in front of him. And that became the driving force, really, behind everything that Batman does. It's like their pasts, their childhoods directly shape their heroic identities.
Yeah. And that difference in their origin stories is so important for understanding how they approach this whole idea of heroism. Superman was raised with hope, so he sees the good in humanity and he always strives to protect that. But Batman, he's haunted by tragedy, so he focuses on preventing more suffering by imposing order on the world, but he does it through this really rigid, unbreakable code.
So you're saying that even though they're fictional characters, these backstories that they have give them a sense of realism, like a psychological depth that helps us connect to them and their motivations. Even though, obviously, none of us have ever had to deal with being sent to Earth from a dying planet or watching our parents get murdered.
Exactly. And it's this connection to their pasts, to the events that shaped them, that I think is what makes them so compelling as characters. They aren't just out there fighting villains, they're also grappling with their own inner demons, their own personal struggles. And we, as the audience, get to see that and connect to that.
Yeah, it's like those early events, those origin stories, they kind of echo throughout their entire careers as heroes, don't they? And speaking of their origins, one thing I found really interesting in this stack of excerpts is this idea that these stories, how Superman and Batman started as heroes, those stories directly impact how they see themselves in the world. Like, if they even belong here at all.
Oh, absolutely.
There was a whole chapter on this whole idea of belonging. And it's really interesting because it kind of flips the script on, like, who's the ultimate outsider between the two of them?
Right.
We typically think of Superman as the one who's always struggling to fit in. I mean, he's an alien, right? It makes sense. And we think of Batman as this wealthy playboy. He's, like, ingrained in Gotham's elite. But this chapter argues that it's actually Superman who finds this profound sense of belonging, and it's because he chooses to be a hero for humanity. And I have to admit, that was not what I was expecting at all.
It's a fascinating take.
It really is.
Yeah.
So how does the book explain that? How does being an alien, how does that make him feel like he belongs here more than anywhere else?
Well, the excerpt argues that by embracing this role of a symbol of hope for humanity, Superman kind of like transcends those alien origins. It's not about where he's from anymore. He's actively choosing to protect humanity, to try to make Earth a better place. And that sense of purpose, using those incredible abilities for something good, for something bigger than himself, it gives him a connection that goes way beyond just fitting in. It's more about contributing, about making a real difference.
That's a really insightful way to look at it. So it's not about him physically blending in or anything like that. It's about his actions. It's the choices he makes that make him feel like he belongs here. So what about Batman? I mean, he's human. He's from Gotham. But he always seems so solitary, like he's choosing to be an outsider.
Right. And that's where this book gets even more interesting, I think. It argues that Batman's isolation, his alienation, it isn't just about a dark costume and a brooding personality. It's actually a crucial part of what makes him so effective as a hero. He's not just an outsider, though, and this is the really interesting part. He's actually alienated even from himself.
Alienated from himself. Okay, what does that even mean?
Well, think about it. He's constantly battling this darkness inside himself, right? The trauma from his past, this enormous weight of his mission. And the book argues that Batman, the whole persona, it isn't just a mask that Bruce Wayne puts on. It's actually a way for him to distance himself from his own pain, to kind of become a symbol instead of a man.
Wow. So you're saying that he's using the Batman persona to almost escape his own humanity in a way, to channel all of that inner turmoil into something larger than life, something almost mythic.
Exactly. And the excerpt even ties this back to Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, that concept we talked about earlier. This chapter argues that Batman embodies this idea, and not because he's physically superior like Superman, but because he's always striving to overcome his own limitations, his own inner demons. He's pushing himself to become more than human.
Okay, see, this is what I love about diving into this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's making me see both of these heroes in a totally new light. It's not just about, like, punching bad guys and stopping bank robberies anymore. It's this internal struggle that really adds a whole other layer of depth to these characters.
I agree.
But of course, that internal struggle, it always plays out in their actions too. And that makes me think about that excerpt, I think it's called Batman, Public Enemy. It takes a look at, some of the potential downsides of how these heroes operate. And it even brings up the environment, which I thought was an interesting take.
Oh, yeah. The one where Lois Lane basically calls out Batman for being a hypocrite.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you think about all of his gadgets, the Batmobile, that massive fortress he has. It definitely made me think twice about the carbon footprint of being a superhero.
Right. It really challenges those assumptions we have about what it means to be a hero in the first place. Like, we tend to focus on the immediate good they do, saving people's lives, stopping criminals. But that chapter makes us think about those long-term consequences. Like, is Batman, even with the best intentions in the world, is he really making the world a better place if his methods are unsustainable in the long run?
That's a really good question. It's like he's so focused on the symptoms of the problem, crime and corruption, that he's overlooking the disease. And maybe that disease is us, our insatiable need for more stuff, more power.
Exactly. And that's where the excerpt brings up this really interesting concept, the metabolic rift. It's this idea that modern life creates this rift, this disconnect between human society and the natural world.
I have to admit, I had to reread that part a couple times.
It is a complex idea, but essentially argues that our entire way of life, how much we consume, it's unsustainable. And it's creating all of these problems that we don't even know how to deal with. And the chapter links this directly back to Batman. It suggests that his reliance on all this technology, constantly building new gadgets, it actually feeds into this cycle of unsustainability.
So it's like Batman's methods, they might be effective right now, in the short term, but they might actually be contributing to the very problems that he's ultimately trying to solve. That's a pretty bold claim.
It is, and it makes you wonder, is there a more sustainable way to be a hero? Does Superman, with his much simpler lifestyle and his powers that come from within, does he offer a less damaging model?
That is a great question. And it's not something I'd really considered before. I don't know if the excerpt necessarily answers that question, but it definitely gets you thinking about the bigger picture. Like, what are the unintended consequences of even the most heroic actions? And speaking of consequences, there's another chapter here I wanted to touch on. This one really threw me for a loop. It's called I Fight Crime in My Sleep.
Ah, yes. The one structured like a therapy session.
Yes.
Where the patient believes he's part of Batman's crime-fighting team.
Exactly.
Which leads to this really interesting exploration of good and evil, heroism, the power of masks and secret identities.
That one really surprised me. It's like a therapy session gone rogue. But it manages to make these really insightful observations about what it means to be a hero. The way the psychiatrist uses the patient's delusions to unpack these darker aspects of both Batman and Superman was really brilliant.
Yeah, the excerpt uses this fictional dialogue to get us questioning our own perceptions of heroes. It reminds us that even the heroes we love the most, they can have these huge blind spots. And that even their actions, even when they're trying to do the right thing, can have these consequences that they never intended. And it also shows us that the line between good and evil is rarely as clear as we want it to be.
It definitely made me think twice about putting heroes up on a pedestal. It's so easy to do, right? We want to believe in simple solutions. We want clear-cut good guys and bad guys. But the world is rarely that simple.
It's true, and I think that's something important to remember.
We often overlook our heroes' flaws, the complexities of their actions, because we want to believe that they have it all figured out.
Exactly. And this chapter, it reminds us that heroism is rarely simple. It often comes with a cost, and with compromises, and consequences. And those aren't always easy things to face, even for the biggest heroes.
It really does make you think about those nuances, doesn't it?
It does.
And speaking of pushing boundaries and challenging our assumptions, there's one last chapter I wanted to touch on before we wrap things up. This one's about transhumanism, and I have to say, it really threw me for a loop at first. It argues that Superman, not Batman, actually represents the true goal of transcending what it means to be human.
Yeah, that's a really interesting argument. When we usually think of transhumanism, we tend to think about like enhancing our existing abilities, right? Like using technology to try to make ourselves stronger or faster or smarter. And that definitely sounds a lot more like Batman style, always pushing himself to be the absolute peak of human potential.
Exactly. He's like the ultimate biohacker, constantly upgrading himself with new tech and training. But this chapter, it takes a different approach. It suggests that true transhumanism, like real transhumanism, it goes way beyond just enhancing what we already have. It's about fundamentally changing what it means to even be human in the first place.
Right, and that's where Superman comes in, because his powers, they aren't enhancements, right? It's not technology, he didn't train for it, it's just part of him. It's his biology, his alien DNA. He is a complete transformation, a being who's like evolved beyond the limits of our species.
So it's not about reaching the peak of what humans can achieve, like Batman. It's about, like, blowing past those limits altogether, embracing a whole new level of existence.
Exactly. And the chapter even talks about the aesthetics of it all, which I thought was really interesting. Like Superman's ability to fly, that effortless soaring through the sky. The book argues that visually that's a way more powerful image of transhumanism than Batman with all his gadgets.
I never thought about it that way, but it's true. There's something so freeing, so limitless about the way Superman flies. It really does make you think about breaking free from those earthly constraints, evolving into something totally new.
And that's what makes this whole debate so compelling. Is the ultimate goal to perfect what we already are, like Batman trying to be the ultimate human? Or is it about embracing something totally new, something we can barely even comprehend right now, like Superman?
It's a question that makes us really confront our own assumptions, about what does it actually mean to be human and what we as a species might be capable of becoming someday.
It's a very philosophical question.
It really is. When we started this whole deep dive into Batman, Superman, and philosophy, I thought it was just going to be a fun look at these two characters.
Yeah.
But it's turned into something so much more.
Well, that's the power of philosophy, isn't it? It's everywhere, even in comic books. And I think that sometimes looking at these big ideas through the lens of something like pop culture, it can make them a lot more accessible, more relatable.
Oh, absolutely. And like you were saying earlier, these characters, even though they're fictional, they act like mirrors in a way. They reflect our values, our own beliefs about the world, even our aspirations back at us. We see ourselves in their struggles, their triumphs, their flaws.
Exactly. And by really taking the time to examine their choices, their motivations, even their weaknesses, I think we gain a deeper understanding of ourselves too, because ultimately we're grappling with some of the same ethical dilemmas they face in the comics. Those same questions of identity, of purpose, of what really matters, even if, most of us don't have superpowers.
Yeah.
Or cool gadgets.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Batman, Superman, and philosophy, what's one thing you hope our listeners are walking away thinking about?
I hope they're left with this sense of wonder and a desire to keep looking deeper, to not just accept things at face value. I want them to remember that Batman and Superman, they're more than just characters. They represent all these different facets of what it means to be human. They offer different ways of approaching the world and different solutions to life's challenges.
It's not about who would win in a fight. It's about these much bigger questions of heroism and morality and what it means to be human in a world that doesn't always make sense.
Exactly. And by engaging with these characters, with the ideas they represent, we challenge our own assumptions. We can start to see the world in new ways and maybe even learn a thing or two about ourselves along the way.
I love that. Well, that is a fantastic note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. And to everyone listening, we'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the endlessly fascinating world of ideas.